Japan is a country that has always impressed me. I mean, I'm a big fan of the country personally, and sort of knowing the Japanese people and knowing what they're like, it's not surprising that when something like this comes around, they absolutely boss it and knock the ball out of the park. So we looked at these charts last week, and again, the situation hasn't changed massively. These are the updated figures here. I'm showing you them side by side, so I'll try not to kind of skip through them too quickly, so you can read them if you're interested. On the left, we've got the cases, and on the right, we've got the deaths from the virus. And again, we're looking at the number of days that have passed since the 100th case was identified in that country. And essentially the idea being that the flatter that line is, so sort of the more that you follow the x-axis, the better you are doing at restricting the spread of the disease, right? Because more time is passing whilst the number of cases on the y-axis is not increasing. So you're exactly doing what we saw in that first graph, right? That's why these graphs are great, because that's exactly that flattening of the curve that everybody's saying needs to be achieved. And then on the right-hand side, it's exactly the same thing, only at point 0 here, it's the time since the 10th death. Okay, so 100 cases on the left, 10th death on the right. In both of these instances, you see those countries there. I think the Asian countries are in that kind of light blue. So on the left, you see South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong. On the right, again, you see Japan and Korea there. And what you can see is that the Asian countries have broken away from that typical trend of pretty much the rest of the world. You see the US, Spain, Italy, right? We know kind of about these countries. We know that they're struggling. We know they've all kind of followed the same trajectory of China pretty much since day one. But we noticed that Japan and South Korea, two very large countries, have successfully managed to restrict the growth. And in the case of Japan, they've actually done an incredible job of reducing the number of people that have died from the illness, from the infection as well. Why is that the case? Well, if we look at this second sort of chart here, I've simplified it a little bit just to show essentially trends here of how easy the virus spreads. So if you look at where Chile, and Brazil is on the left, you see there at the moment they're experiencing a doubling every 2 days. Again, I have to stress that this is just in the data that's being reported. Okay, this is not necessarily actually how many people have the illness or the disease in the country. The actual true rate might be a lot faster than this, but again, we'll just use the same data for all countries, because even if all these rates are double as fast, it's still the relative difference between the countries that we're interested in. So you see that every 3 days, you see the doubling there in Spain, Germany, France, Italy, okay, pretty much all the European countries following that trajectory. In South Korea, you see it's doubling every 5 days, and in Japan, Singapore, you see that the number of cases are doubling every 10 days, okay, so a huge reduction in the growth rate of the infections of the virus. Now, why is that the case? The first thing appears to be Japan's reaction to the virus. Okay, so Japan's obviously a close neighbor to China. Japan essentially very early in the process, so right back to the start of the year. Again, this started in China and pretty much towards the end of November, early December last year. So very early on in this whole epidemic, Japan kind of got panicked early, but it was kind of like a good kind of panic. They made people very aware of the severity of this. They could kind of see what was happening, right? They could see what their neighbor China was doing and how extreme the measures in China went and how quickly those measures went in place to try and restrict it. So they could see what a lot of us could see, a month or two ago. They could see how serious this was going to be, and that actually by acting early, they had the best chance of preventing this from being a huge problem. So they panicked early and acted with prudence, right? And one thing that we kind of discussed is kind of Japanese population, right? That they tend to be culturally law-abiding citizens on the whole. They do tend to have a higher trust of the government maybe than many other countries around the world. And so when the government said, you need to be worried about this, you have to take it seriously, they did, okay? Just contrast that to how the UK have responded to this whole thing, right? And how people in England have, Boris is saying the pubs are going to close tomorrow, so don't go to the pub, and huge swathes of the population are going to the pub that night, right? That's the difference between the two countries there. The second thing that Japan did was that pretty much from day one they were wearing masks, right? Now, read a lot of reports that are, criticizing, let's say, the effectiveness of these masks. But if everybody is wearing them, if there's a culture of wearing masks, then we do know that it can restrict the transmission to a degree. It doesn't make you invincible by having the mask on, but it certainly can help. So it's in the culture that they do tend to wear masks anyway, which helps, right? And it also helps with having things like the availability of masks anyway. Obviously in the UK, people just don't wear them naturally, so they were available and people wore them from day one. That helped restrict the spread. Japan placed restrictions very early, so unlike in this country where it took what appeared to be quite a while before the government eventually said, right, if you're vulnerable, stay at home. I felt like that should have been announced 6 weeks ago. It took a long time for that to happen. In Japan, those restrictions were placed extremely early, and they enforced the restrictions as well. Dare I say, actually, in Japan, they wouldn't even need to enforce them because, like I said, about Japanese people being very good law-abiding citizens, but those restrictions were enforced. People had to take it seriously, and they did. The fourth thing, which I think is very interesting when we compare it to other countries, other European countries, is that Japan's social factors, right? Its culture, for instance, the way they greet people, right? Which is with a bow, as I'm sure most of you know. But Japanese people have a very hands-off kind of approach when meeting people, greeting people, congratulating people, reporting to their superiors, whatever it is. Okay, it's very respectful, but people keep a respectful distance. Now, I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do. Obviously, in countries like the Netherlands, where they kiss 3 times on the cheeks, in France, in Italy, where it's much closer, there's a culture of hugging people and generally showing your affection that way. It's not that one's bad and one's good. It's just purely that when you look at trying to prevent a virus from spreading, one's clearly much more effective from the get-go than the other. And so that's possibly a reason why in some areas of Italy and France and Spain, in these countries, you find that the infections spread a lot easier. And that's just because of the social norms of those countries. Of course, in any of those countries where people get ill, they don't do that. But as we know, with this virus, the period of developing the symptoms, developing the virus, that kind of period is about 5 days long. And so, in that period, with all that kind of usual interaction, you can spread it to many people. And that's obviously something that isn't done in Japan, with the way that they greet, the way that they bow, the fact they don't shake hands, etc. Number 5 is the availability and culture of using hand sanitizer. Again, it's something that's just a norm in Japan. It's just the way that the culture, the way that society is there. Again, it helps. We heard very early in this country how effective it was, that you could kill the virus if it was on your hands, for instance, by simply just washing them, and as Boris said, by singing happy birthday twice. So they didn't need to sing happy birthday twice in Japan. They just washed their hands with sanitizer anyway. And finally, and I think this is the most important thing, is that in Japan, the elderly people were isolated extremely fast. So we talked about putting restrictions in, and they were like societal restrictions, as you see now today in the UK. But as we discussed about that 20% of people being the most vulnerable, Japan isolated them ASAP, which just meant that, that's why they've got so few deaths. That's why we see on that chart that Japan's deaths is pretty flat, right? And that's because the most vulnerable people were isolated. And one thing I will say, again, talking about the culture of Japan, is that quite a lot of old people do tend to live alone, right? And so it is easier to isolate people when they're already living on their own. They're culturally used to living on their own. They don't necessarily have the same dependencies that maybe older family has in maybe Italy, right? Where we know that the culture is very much family inclusive, family orientated, and the kind of families are much closer, much tighter knit together. And so again, that's probably another good reason why Japan has been able to adopt these measures, but also implement them successfully. There's 6 things. I think they're quite interesting. Again, some of them I think countries around the world can look at and go, okay, for instance, like panicking early, the good type of panic. I think that's something that the UK would have definitely benefited from, so people took it seriously. I'm not saying it's good to panic huge swathes of the population, but I do think it's good to make people aware that this is a very serious issue. And I think the problem with the UK government was that they had a plan all along that wasn't particularly well communicated. they kind of made it sound at times like they weren't going to do a measure when we always knew they were going to. It's just they weren't doing it today, but they were going to do it a couple of days later. And I think the UK gambled a little bit with the herd immunity thing, realised that it was going to be a bit of a risk, and unless they really did enforce isolation measures on the most vulnerable, that it probably wasn't going to work, as in you were going to end up infecting a lot of people that really shouldn't be infected. And so they kind of backtracked a little bit on it. Okay, in the meantime, it helped ease a little bit the NHS, but it didn't really, because I feel like a lot of vulnerable people did end up getting infected from the disease that really shouldn't have, if they'd followed the kind of plan that Japan put together. So yeah, lots for countries to analyze there. And as I discussed, culturally, countries like Japan, with the way their society is, they're definitely well set up from the get-go to kind of tackle something like this.